Hello guys, in the previous videos we have talked about how to install Python via Anaconda platform, also talked about how to run Python code, as well as the Jupyter Notebook introduction. Today we will dive in to learn Python variables. So what is variable? Variables are used for storing data values and reused later. So it's like a container in Python that you can use to store the values and retrieve this value later on for other purposes. Today's video will focus on below learning items. So let's get started. So first, how to define a variable. Variable is created after you assign a value to it. You can use a equal sign to assign a variable. For example, a equals 2. We assign value 2 to a variable a. Or you can assign a string, let's say cj, as a value and assign to a variable b. And you can even assign an empty string to a variable. So remember, if you are assigning a value as a string, you have to put a double quotation or simple quotation. In here, I'm using a double quotation, but you can also use a simple quotation. It will output the same result. So in Python, it doesn't matter you use a single quotation or double quotation to define a variable. Once you define the variable, how do we output the variable? You use a print statement in Python to print out the variables. For example, A, B, and C have already defined in the first row. Run this line of code. And once we have run the code, now we can print them out. So let's hit the run for running the print statement for variable a, b, and c. You can see a variable a equals to 2 has printed out here, and variable b is cj or printed out in the second row, and the variable c is the empty string. Since it's empty, so it's not showing anything here. So need to know, in Python there are major data types. So I have to categorize in this notes section. Later on we will dive in each of the data types in later tutorials. Today we will just focus on the data type integer and string for learning variables. So in Python it's not necessary to define data type for each variable you create in Python. Basically, like above example, when you say a equals to 2, we can tell 2 is an integer. But if we give a quotation to the number here, it will turn the number 2 to a string. So let's give an example here. In Python, you can define data types via a constructor function, which in here, if we put the number 2 in the int constructor function, it will define this variable value as an integer. Int in here represent to integer. And in the second row, you can also define number 2 as a string. So let's create a variable a underscore plus. And if you put str parentheses and put 2 in there, it would turn this number 2 to a string. And for the variable b, the system will automatically categorize it as a string because there's a double quotation in here. Or you can, to make your code more clear to read, you can always use str constructor function when defining a value as a variable. So let's print them. So you can see the variable a and a underscore plus has the same print result. And so how do we know the variable types? In Python, you use a type function to know what the variable types. So in here, let's print out a. You can separate the print result by using a comma. So it's print parentheses a, comma, type parentheses a, using the type function to know what is the data type for a. So let's apply the same for other two variables. Then let's run this row. Then you can tell the first a, the variable result a, is a integer, and the a underscore plus, it shows it's a string, and the b and the variable b is a string as well. So when sometimes you get confused what data type does your variable belong to, you can always use the type function to print out the variable types. if the variable belongs to the same data type, you can add them together by using the plus sign in the print statement. So this is an example. We define x as a string, and we define x as a string John, and y also defined as a string Smith. Then we can hit the run button here, and you can see these two strings are added together. The same if you have a variable name t equals to 1 and x equals to 5, and you can also print t plus x. And let's comment this out. We have learned how to comment is using the hashtag. It will ignore this line when you run the code. Let's print out result here. So you can see t and x print out result as a 6 because they are in the same data type, so they can be added together. But what if we assign a data type string to t to number 1 and assign data type string to the number 5 here as well? Let's take a guess. What the result will be? Will it still be 6 or something else? Let's print. It will print out result 1, 5. Don't get it confused to you. This is not 15. It will add two numbers, but in here it's adding up two strings, not two numbers. So it's 1 as a string 1 added to string 5. So it's 1, 5. So need to be really careful when we convert numbers to a string. So like I said, if using a different data type, but how about adding a different data types? Let's give a try. We have x here is a string. Let's change this back to t equals to 1 is an integer. X is a string. So let's print out x string plus t an integer. What the result will be? This will give you a type error and also showing you cannot add integer to a string. Be careful when you add in variables together. Make sure they are in the same data type. Now let's talk about variable override. So when a variable was defined, is it possible to change the variable value? Yes, correct. You can certainly change the variable value, also change the data type that I mentioned before. As an example here, if you define x equals to 5, 6, 7, it's an integer that you can tell here. And if you print out result, will give you 5, 6, 7. But if you define the same variable name as a string here, let's define the same x variable equals to hello, I have changed my value, then what the result will be. So let's hit run button. So you can tell this 5, 6, 7 is from the first print statement, and the second print statement print out the same variable x but has a different value now because we define x again here. So remember to not use the same variable name unless intended to. You have defined this variable before and intend to change its value. Otherwise, be careful when you define a variable, make sure this wasn't defined before. So let's understand variable naming rules. There are 5 major rules when you give a name to a variable. So the first is variable name must start with a letter or underscore character. A variable name cannot start with a number. A variable name can only contain alphanumeric characters and underscores. Variable names are case sensitive. Also avoid using Python reserved keywords as a variable. Below I have given you legit variable name examples. You can define the same value using a different variable naming rules. Make sure do not breach the rule when you define a variable name. Here has some incorrect variable name examples. Like the first one, the variable name started with a number. And second, the variable used hyphen in between. And third, the variable has a space in between. And fourth and fifth, the variable used Python reserved keywords. And true and print are Python reserved keywords. So we want to avoid using them defining variables. And this is an example of variable names are case sensitive. Lowercase a, let's define as a integer 3, and uppercase a, we can define as the variable as a string. Then when you print out the result, we show you two different variable outcome result. So in the professional world, there are Defining a variable is very important because the project you created, the first variable you defined, most likely will be used many times by other people who ever take over the project in later years. So make sure you define your variable in a clear way. For a large project, people even use known variable names to make the definitions clear. So for example, here has the two common ways people use for naming unknown variables. So the first common way is people start the variable name as a lowercase, and for each of the words they use uppercase in the first letter. Like this one as an example, this is a variable name. You can clearly read it. To be more clear, you can also use underscore to separate each of the words. Both ways would work, and also there are other ways like people capitalize everything. It's really up to your preference and how to make your code clean and readable. To make your code also easier to read, you can assign in multiple values to variables and assign a same value to multiple variables. So what does it mean? If you want to define a variable a, b, and c to three different values, you can put comma in between and equals to three different values also separate by comma. When you print out the result, you can see A, B, and C all have assigned value, and the value you define in one statement. You don't have to write three different rows. You can also assign a same value to multiple variables. In here, we define A equals to B, B equals to C, C equals to John, means A, B, and C, they all equals to John. Let's print out result. You can tell the result is the same when you want to define the same value to multiple variables. Global variable. This part may be harder to understand. When you create a variable outside a function, it means it's a global variable. It is okay if you don't understand. I will explain in later videos of Python functions. Basically, you just need to know when the function is defined, Python language will not run the function unless you call the function. If you define a variable a equals to good and define function and the print statement in the function, if you don't call the function, it will not print out the result. So in here, like I said, the variables, if it has the same data type, it can be added together. The first variable here is my life is a string, and plus a is also a string. So when I run the code to take action of this function, you will see the printed result. For running the same function, if you define the a again within the function, what the result will be? It will replace the global variable in here because I ran the print statement within the function. This is another example. We define two functions here. The first function, we already know the result. The a variable will be override with the new value in the function. But the second function didn't define a in the function. What the result will be? The result will show in the variable a adapted the global variable value. Because like I said before, in Python function, if you do not run the function, the Python will ignore the function. The second a variable is defined in the first function, but we didn't call the first function. It's being ignored. That's why the second function, when we call the second function, the variable a will adapt a global variable. And last but not least, you can always use the keyword global to define a variable in the function to make that as a global variable. When here the first function and we define a as a global variable again, the a will turn to be a global variable, but we have to first call the function first. Let's call the both function result. So now you can see the global variable a has override the variable outside the function because we call the global within the function, and this a result also replace the a result in the second function. This is a bit confusing at the moment. Once you learn functions in later tutorials, you should have a much clearer view of this. So that's it for today's video. Please feel free to leave any comment if you have any questions, and please don't forget to click the like button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you.